I'm Thierry Heles. This is The Next Leap. If you've never been in a licensing negotiation, you might think Big Pharma always has the upper hand over startups desperate to get a deal done to secure licensing fees and milestone payments. But usually, these are two parties that share the same goal, although sometimes a startup has a product so good it holds all the cards. Deal negotiations between pharma companies and biotechs are the bread and butter of Winsome Cheung, a partner in the life sciences transaction group at global law firm Covington, where she's represented clients on both sides of the table. Winsome, who during her PhD in medicine explored commercializing her research with Cambridge Enterprise, ponders how that experience went on to shape her thinking as a lawyer on today's episode of the podcast. We also talk about industry trends she's observed in recent years, provisions in licensing contracts that could scupper M&A deals years down the line, and why universities should have standardized templates in place for things like material transfer agreements. Let's nerd out over contract law. Winsome, welcome.
Thank you, Thierry.
I'm going to start with an easy question, hopefully. Can you tell me about your law firm and specifically the life sciences transaction group that you're in?
Of course. So I'm a partner at Covington and Burling. It's a law firm that's headquartered in DC. It's an international law firm. It's been around for over 100 years, so very well established. And I'm based in a London office working in their life sciences transactions team. So I work almost exclusively with life sciences clients from the earliest stages of startups all the way through to big pharma companies on some of the most complex and important strategic collaborations and licensing arrangements and their partnering arrangements and commercial and IP matters throughout the entire product life cycle. And our firm has this real focus in a number of industry sectors. One of them is life sciences, which I very much enjoy working in. So yeah, very pleased to be on this podcast to speak to you about these topics.
Amazing. And I look forward to hearing your insights. As we said, life sciences, you work in law today, obviously. You have an MSc in biochemistry and a PhD in medicine, though, where you explored commercializing research with Cambridge Enterprise, which is very cool. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience in your earlier career journey?
Oh, absolutely. It all started when I was applying for university. It was during the time when the first human genome got published. That got me very inspired because it promised to unlock a whole new world of opportunity. So I applied for biochemistry for my first degree. I got a place at Imperial College London to do a biochemistry degree with a year in Europe. And after that, I decided to continue with my academic endeavors and did a PhD in medicine, focusing on rotaviruses. And it was a really fantastic experience because I worked with a fantastic team. My supervisor at the time, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me naming him, is Dr. Ulrich Desselberger. He's to date still one of the people I admire the most. He's just one of the most brilliant, most hardworking, one of my best mentors throughout both my scientific and legal careers. And he's a real thought leader in the rotaviruses space. And under his leadership, we actually found a specific pathway for rotaviruses, that the rotaviruses actually hijacks a component in a cell called lipid droplets in order for their own replication. And we found that if we administer drugs that disperses these lipid droplets, it actually reduces the rotaviral replication rates. So we think, well, this could be quite a good basis for potential therapeutic for rotaviruses. And we actually went through a process where we contacted Cambridge Enterprise to see whether there are any opportunities for us to potentially get investment and to commercialize this particular invention and to file a patent on that kind of invention. Now, in the end, for a number of reasons, that didn't go ahead. But that did actually give me an insight as to the idea of having a kind of commercial translation of your academic discovery, which when I was doing my PhD was still not very sort of well communicated to scientists. Often, you either have this sort of academic, quite purist approach about you do your bench science, you publish a fantastic paper, you not necessarily want to progress to commercialization. It could be seen as going a little bit in a dark side, if you will. But I do think the culture has changed a lot as I see it, especially in my line of work, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
It was a really great experience. We did publish some really great papers there. And I have to say, one of the reasons I admire my PhD supervisor amongst a lot of people the most was because there was another project another PhD student was working on, and it's on a reverse engineering rotavirus model.
Okay.
And in the end, he didn't find that for a number of years in his career, for decades in his career, he was trying to find this model. He didn't find it, but a Japanese group actually discovered that independently. And his reaction was, Winsome, isn't this fantastic? Let's improve upon it. And I think with that kind of spirit, he definitely really inspires me, both in science and also in my legal career, that you can really look at this kind of world as a place of infinite success rather than a kind of zero-sum game.
Yeah, it's a very wise attitude to have, to look at, someone else made the discovery that you've been trying to make. And rather than, getting angry that someone else has gotten there first, you're like, well, this is still just the first step in a long process of discoveries.
Absolutely. It is very wise indeed. And also, it actually made me respect him and other people respect him a lot more. It's not about being the first to get the fancy paper out. It's how you approach things in your career. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's so well respected in the field. So I do think my academic journey taught me a lot, not only from a technical side of things, but also how to approach life and work in general. It's been a really fantastic experience.
Yeah, it really sounds like it. What prompted you to move into law then? Was that experience with Cambridge Enterprise and seeing commercial pathways?
Oh yeah, that was definitely quite an eye-opening experience, because while I really enjoyed working in a scientific field and I love the science, I didn't necessarily want to become a bench lawyer doing that kind of lab work on a day-to-day basis. I was exploring other opportunities to work in areas adjacent to science where I could apply my knowledge in other kinds of settings. And that commercialization process actually gave me some inspiration as to there could be careers, for example, say becoming a patent attorney. I've always really enjoyed reading the writings, so the prospect of being able to practice in patent law as a patent attorney really appealed to me, and I could get to sort of learn a lot about different kinds of science. And from that, I started exploring more sort of legal careers. And initially, I decided to look at law just a little bit more broadly. And I applied to a training contract in an international law firm, not Covington, an international law firm, initially to become a patent litigator. But I realized I just really enjoyed my transactional seat. It was a corporate seat. But what I loved about transactional work was you've got two teams of people who are trying to make something happen. So there are many deals where you could create a real win-win situation. And I really love the kind of cut and thrust of it, the thrill of being part of a deal. So when the opportunity opened up at Covington to do life sciences transactions, I just really jumped at it because it combines life sciences and also transactional work. And that was over 10 years ago now, so I haven't really looked back since then.
That's fantastic. Let's start looking at your work then, and maybe start with a fairly broad question. What are some of the technology trends that you've seen emerge in life sciences over the past few years?
Yeah, some really interesting trends emerging, because just broadly from an indications perspective, some years ago, almost all of the deals that come across our table would be oncology deals. But now we see a real variety of indications in inflammatory diseases, neurology. You've got a lot more variety of modalities as well, which makes things a lot more interesting. And in recent times, we've been doing quite a bit of work on biologics. You've got bispecific antibodies, you've got derivatives of antibodies, you see trispecific antibodies. So there's a lot of great work there, a lot of antibody drug conjugate deals coming through. The other modality that really sort of gained a lot more traction in the past couple of years is radioligand therapies, using radioactivity in a targeted way to, say, treat cancer. So that's something that's been around for some time, but it's really in the last couple of years where deals really kind of flew off. And the other thing, of course, is GLP-1. So I think with the emergence of GLP-1 products, it's really become a huge market. And it's become a sort of a wonder drug because GLP-1 has been seen to be able to treat a variety of indications. So everyone wants a piece of the pie. So if you've got something that could treat a particular indication a little bit better, maybe improving the efficacy, the tolerability, maybe a particular dosage form that's a little bit better, all of that could create a bit of commercial edge. So you get a lot of deals and pharma companies trying to get a piece of this pie, which is quite interesting. And the other thing is, of course, cell and gene therapy, because a few years ago, a lot of deals that come across my desk would be cell and gene. You get a lot of headline deals involving cell and gene therapy platforms and technologies that attracted a lot of big dollar value. In the past years, that trend has decreased somewhat, but it's been quite promising actually. Earlier this year, you see a couple of quite significant deals in the cell and gene therapy space. So it does show there's still pharma interest in this particular modality. And I think a lot of it has to do with the cost of cell and gene therapy products because it is incredibly labor intensive and also resource intensive to actually manufacture. But at the end of the day, it is backed by some really staggering data. So that interest will continue to remain. And of course, you get a lot of AI interest, shall we say. And from a pharma side, most of these key deals we've been involved in would be using AI in drug discovery to make that process more efficient, more automated, and more targeted to find new drugs. So yeah, quite a few deals in that space as well.
I'm glad to hear that cell and gene therapy hasn't disappeared because, as you say, a few years ago, that was the hype and it has quieted down. I find it quite interesting as well that you mentioned the GLP-1 as a sort of a wonder drug because I think a lot of people will just think of Ozempic, which is obviously the main big drug that uses GLP-1 at the moment. So it's quite interesting that pharma is thinking about it in ways beyond that and how it could be used to improve human health beyond making people skinny. Which, should we be taking drugs to lose weight? Yeah, I feel a bit conflicted about that. It's good to hear that they're actually interested in it far beyond that one drug. What are some of the financial trends that have emerged in recent years? Have they maybe been influenced by the new modalities that have come along?
That's a really interesting question. In terms of sort of financial trends, as in sort of deal structuring type trends. If we talk about the new modalities, a lot of the financial structuring depends on the degree of risk involved in the particular product. Because if a pharma company wants to take on a particular product, if it's, say, very early stage, or it's got a particular target which is not validated yet, or maybe it's a modality which is relatively new, they don't necessarily want to just pay up a whole chunk of money to buy out the entire asset. So a lot of the deals I work on are licensing deals, which is a very tried and tested method in the pharma space where you pay some upfront, but based on the success of the product, you'll pay milestones and royalties, which fits quite well with this biotech model where you get quite a fair bit of risk taking on a new product. And you're absolutely right. Say cell and gene, for example, I think the whole collaboration and licensing model has worked quite well for those kind of technologies. First of all, there's a collaborative element to that. A lot of pharma companies might not necessarily have the current capability to work on specific types of cell and gene therapy. So that collaborative process really helps to transfer the program to the big pharma in a very effective way. And also with these kind of new modalities, it's more likely that the pharma company might prefer something a little bit more de-risked, if you will, whether it's a licensing deal, and increasingly we're seeing more and more option to acquire license where there will be a collaboration for a period of time. The pharma company receives a data package, and based on that data package can exercise a go, no-go decision to trigger the option to get a full license. But of course, we also see some pretty hot assets out there because ultimately it is underlined by the real need for a pharma company to refresh the pipeline, to bring in new assets, especially in the face of looming patent cliffs. Or we often see some really hot assets out there and you've got multiple farmers trying to really get their hands on it. And in those cases, the biotech company who is the originator of the assets might be able to go for a more lucrative deal, maybe an outright acquisition or much bigger upfront than they otherwise would get. So it really depends ultimately on how much de-risking is needed for that particular asset and how desirable that asset ultimately is for the pharma companies.
Yeah. You've managed to answer one of my other questions, which was around this image that maybe it can be a bit of a David and Goliath situation where startups may be the less strong negotiator. But it sounds like that's not necessarily true. They might hold more cards than might be obvious.
I'm really glad you asked that question because I represent a real spectrum of companies, all the way from biotech companies through to big pharma companies. So I've experienced the negotiation from both sides and understanding the concerns and considerations of both sides of the spectrum. And I agree, I don't think one should stereotype it always as a David and Goliath situation because at the end of the day, it is about negotiation power. Sometimes when people think about biotech companies and they always think they're in a sort of less advantageous position because they're cash strapped, they really need to get the deal done, sometimes at any cost, which could be true in some cases. But equally, I've been representing either biotech companies or pharma companies where we're looking at a biotech company with a really great asset, with really strong data, and it's very desirable. And I think when a biotech company has those kind of assets, they need to remember the negotiation power they actually have. That really turns the tables, in which case they could really have the calling card, if you will, in terms of the kinds of financial and other terms they need from the pharma companies. So ultimately, I do think it's to be aware of your negotiation position and really understand what the strengths of your asset is and what kind of cards you have and really focus your negotiations around that really real understanding. Then automatically assuming just because you're a younger company, you're somehow disadvantaged in a particular way.
I suppose that is where a good lawyer comes in and good advisors come in and to help them understand the position that the founders are in.
Absolutely.
What are some of the common challenges that come up in negotiations then?
Some of the common challenges often relate to the parties not knowing what they really want from the negotiation. And it sounds like a very logical thing, but it's not uncommon sometimes parties go into negotiations. They just really want to get a deal done, but they are not clear in their heads how they want the deal done. What are the most important things for them? What do they want to achieve out of the transaction? And often it's easy for them to focus on the process because they can control the process. And sometimes they even focus on the minutiae of a deal and forgetting the big picture because it's something they can really push forwards. And I find those kind of situations is so important from our end to set the kind aside and just to take a step back, rather than spending time just creating reams and reams of paper trail, thinking you're busy doing something, right? Actually take a step back and think, what are we doing here? What are the things I really want to achieve from this particular transaction? What are the red lines? What are the goals I want to achieve? So I think having that vision, I think, is incredibly important for negotiations to go well from both sides. The other bit that somewhat relates to that COVID era, I think, often I find, while it's incredibly efficient, you could actually negotiate the entire deal over Zoom or Teams. I found that process sometimes potentially could be less efficient because there's no impersonal contacts that builds the trust. A lot of negotiations sometimes could be unnecessarily adversarial because the parties haven't had a chance to build that trust with each other. We are just two parties coming together to create a new collaboration or do a deal that potentially could be a win-win situation. Now, I do see more clients going back to an in-person facing negotiation model. I don't think we ever really go back to what it was before, but at least, there would be portions of it That could be in person. Some portions could be on Teams, but there should be a little bit more focus on that kind of relationship building, because when there's no trust between the parties in the negotiations, it could really break down quite quickly.
That makes complete sense. And I get that, building that trust, which is so much easier to do if you're in the same room. You might have a coffee together before you kind of get into the negotiations. Like you just appreciate the other person as a human being that ultimately wants the same thing as you do, either sell or buy whatever you have to sell or buy.
Absolutely, because having represented biotech companies and pharma companies, actually people who work in all of these organizations are really similar. They have been in the life science industry for a long time. They might have an academic background in life sciences. They believe in the science, they believe in the products, and they want to make the deal work. When people forget that element sometimes, as you say, thinking, oh, it's a David and Goliath situation. Is the other counterparty doing this with an intention to do something nefarious? It's often is just not the case. I think having that building of relationship is incredibly important. That goes way before, I reckon, lawyers are drafted in to do the actual negotiations themselves.
Yeah. Is there specific advice that you would maybe give to founders coming to a first-time negotiation, or companies that are coming to a negotiation?
I think I sort of just collating some of the themes I alluded to. First of all, I think building that relationship is incredibly important. Say if you're going into negotiations with pharma, for example, really finding that champion in pharma, building that relationship with pharma representatives, I think is really important. It's a very strong base for the entire transaction. And the other thing is really understanding the key objectives. What are you trying to get out of the deal? If you're doing a deal with pharma, are you trying to gain more expertise from pharma to help with you building your clinical capabilities or commercialization capabilities? Or is it purely a commercial play? You just want to get as much non-dilutive funding as possible. I think knowing those kind of priorities are incredibly important, because at the end of the day, whether you're biotech or pharma, you only have so much negotiation firepower. So you have to focus your negotiation on the most important things. So focusing on the goals of that, I think, is incredibly important. And the other thing I think for a younger company not to lose sight of is often you might be doing a licensing deal, collaboration deal for the reasons I mentioned, but you always have to keep your eyes on the real price. It could be attracting the next big investment, or maybe ultimately going through an M&A process, returning value to shareholders. So sometimes I see biotech companies feel pressurized to enter into deals. For example, maybe certain split territory deals, or giving away certain indications or certain applications for a platform, or giving away exclusivity rights without really thinking through the ramifications. And we've seen situations where several years down the line, there's real interest from a pharma company to get a really good licensing deal from them, or even acquiring them for an M&A process. But they're discouraged, or the deal could actually be scuppered because of some of these earlier rights they've given away, or some of the things younger companies have done that later manifests itself as a red flag M&A or big investment situation. So I do think it is important for younger companies to get good advice. It doesn't always have to be very expensive, because it's not the kind of approach where you necessarily need to leave no stone unturned, but to have a very focused approach on the most important things that typically could create risks or red flags in the future for M&A and investment situations. I think it's quite important for younger companies to think the long term and not just kind of the here and now.
Yeah. How do you future-proof these early stage deals then? Are there specific things, concessions that you as a lawyer would say you shouldn't give this away because this will be a red flag? Is it just experience, or is that something that you kind of have to figure out on a case-by-case basis?
I think most of these deals are quite bespoke. So there's always some elements of a case-by-case basis. But for us, we've got the opportunity to advise big pharma companies on deals such as M&A deals, where we regularly do due diligence exercises on biotech companies they want to purchase. So through that exercise, it really is quite eye-opening to me as to the range of potential issues that can manifest themselves in a diligence report. So when I represent younger companies, biotech companies, I want to make sure those kind of points wouldn't be in the documentation, that we agree in that process. And I think that always can be a really good deal to be struck for both parties, that A gets what the biotech company wants and also what a pharma company wants, but protecting the biotech's interest. Because if you explain your reasoning to your counterparty, very often they will accept that if it's a legitimate reason. But the key is to really spotting those kind of issues. One of the buckets of issues relate to the scope of rights you give away. I think I mentioned that before. And especially say you've got a platform technology, and one of the models is to license out that platform for multiple indications, maybe multiple field of use licenses. You might license out specific indications and targets under your platform technology, which is a completely sound and good model. But when you think about it, if you give away particular rights that encumber your platform more broadly, or give away more rights than you should be giving, then you're potentially reducing the chance of being able to do further deals under your particular platform. And a very classic example is sometimes biotech companies would agree to exclusivity obligations over certain targets, and they do many different kinds of deals over time. And then several years later, they look back, actually, the entire platform could become really quite encumbered, and there might not be that much value left after sort of looking at the totality of the restrictions and rights that will be granted over the technology. Making sure you only grant exactly the slice of rights the counterparty is entitled to and draft it in its very crisp way, I think is really important. The other thing, which is incredibly important, especially in M&A setting, is to avoid any kind of reach through IP grants, because sometimes there are clauses that essentially could potentially be read to capture the IP of the big pharma companies. So say if a biotech company grants an out-license to a pharma company under IP the biotech controls or its affiliates control, of course, after the M&A deal, the big pharma could become its affiliates, and the big pharma IP could then be inadvertently sucked through the license grant. And that could be seen as a bit of a red flag. So again, making sure even innocuous words such as, the license or its affiliates, just think about that very carefully about an M&A setting, whether this would inadvertently create a kind of red flag situation for the big pharma company. And the other thing is to always think through any ramifications that relate to change of control. So when you negotiate these documents, always think into the future. What happens if you get acquired by a big pharma company? Do these provisions still stand, in the same way as it would if I'm a smaller biotech? Future-proofing and thinking through those kind of scenarios, I think, is quite important. What there's a red flag scenario is sort of exclusivity provisions sometimes. If you're a very small company, sure, I promise I wouldn't work in this particular space. And you agree all kinds of clauses that bind the biotech company and its affiliates would agree not to work in that particular space. But of course, if the company gets acquired in the future and is part of a bigger pharma group, that could then bind the entire pharma company, which again could create a red flag situation. In terms of numbers of words, it could just be a few words, but it could really make or break a deal in the future.
That is, and I mean, I am not a lawyer, so I obviously haven't thought about these things. But it is amazing the complexity of these early stage deals and how one sentence could potentially ruin an M&A deal 3, 4, 5 years down the line.
And that really pains me when I see that, because often that's not the intention of any party to do something like this. And it's just not good for a biotech company because they might lose out on opportunities. And that's not good for the pharma company either, because they would be very keen to buy that particular company asset without these consequences attached. From a professional pride perspective, this is something I really focus on personally, to make sure ultimately there could be like a win-win outcome for both the biotech side and the pharma side.
Yeah. Have you ever seen, and I'm not asking you to name names, but have you ever seen a deal between a biotech and a pharma succeed, quote unquote, but then maybe damage the relationship, or something happened that kind of meant that they didn't want to work together long term? And what was the reasons behind that?
I have observed some deals where I think it's to do with the trust point, because sometimes when you negotiate licensing and collaborations, the kinds of lawyers we see in our space are often people, if we have to be firm, we'll be firm and we fight for our clients are the key points. But it's never going to be unnecessarily aggressive or impolite, because ultimately what you're trying to create is a blueprint for success for many years to come. After people have these discussions across each other at the negotiation table, they sign a dotted line. That's where the real work begins, and the parties need to collaborate and they need to succeed. So generally, collaborations and licensing deals that are not set up for success, maybe there's not a good foundation of trust being built in, and also not thinking through some of the provisions in a very productive way or very practical way. I think sometimes it's easy maybe for lawyers to even superimpose certain points, but without actually checking whether in reality, whether that actually works for collaboration. So I think that conversation and upfront investment in terms of lawyer, biotech, lawyer, pharma, understanding how it actually works on the ground and trying to reflect that in this collaboration, I think is incredibly important. And also be reasonable. You might feel you're sometimes winning all sorts of points that are not frankly needed. And I think sometimes when those points are discovered during the course of the collaboration, there could be cases where, the trust is eroded because maybe the other side feels that wasn't the spirit of the discussion and negotiation. So I do think being fair is important in the long run, because ultimately it is a collaboration based on relationships between the two parties that ultimately has to be based on good science and also a healthy degree of trust as well.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I realize that tech transfer officers are maybe a bit removed from when you meet these companies, but do you have any advice for universities or tech transfer offices when they set up these companies to give them the best start in life?
I think that's a really good point, because for tech transfer licensing arrangements, it is actually quite different to other kinds of licensing and collaboration agreements in a way that I do firmly believe the interests of the tech transfer officers and the company should be entirely aligned. If the company succeeds in the future, that's a big win for the tech transfer company. That's a huge source of revenues for the university. As they say, it's far better to have 1% of a blockbuster than 100% of nothing, right? I do believe that is the case for the tech transfer companies. And I have seen approaches of tech transfer offices evolve with time. And I think now tech transfer offices, the way to deal with licensing agreements are getting more and more sophisticated, more and more commercially savvy. And I just really love that. I think this is a great trend and it absolutely should continue. Make sure the licensing terms is calibrated to what market terms, because ultimately the customer of the company, as I mentioned, would be an investor, sophisticated investor, or a big pharma company. And those licenses really shouldn't include items that would be considered as red flags or yellow flags for M&A and investment transactions. And I think that's incredibly important. So it is a tricky situation, because from a tech transfer office perspective or university perspective, they want to protect the rights, because they are giving away rights that are owned by the university, which also the university has a duty to disseminate for broader educational benefit. So that's obviously a really important thing, and biotech companies will have to work with that. But at the same time, it shouldn't be done in a way that scuppers the commercial value of a product. So being pragmatic about striking that balance is extremely important. I mean, a very classic example is a publication clause where giving the university the opportunity to publish, but putting in the right protective mechanisms. So for certain core IP, there's an opportunity to delay publication until a relevant point in time, for example, a patent filing. Those kind of things I think are quite important. I think over time, there's already sort of some pretty good mechanisms being built in to some of these licensing arrangements and commercial agreements with university. That sort of achieves a good balance. And I'd like to see those kind of clauses become even more leaning towards being pragmatic and commercially friendly, if you will. I think there's still a lot of scope to do that. And the other thing I often find with tech transfer offices, they often have, a lot of deals on the table, and it is pretty challenging to deal with so many different demands. But my hope is that there would be that sort of future looking, that there'd be completely standard, say, material transfer agreements, confidential agreement, those kind of agreements that actually are good for the company and just allow those types of agreements to be signed up really quickly. Because I've seen situations where the founder or a lab actually transfer materials or information, for example, without an MTA or NDA in place that created all sorts of issues and potentially even invalidating patents later on because that process just took so long. And that kind of thing is entirely preventable. So I would love to see there's no one size fits all, but at least a really good basis of those kind of agreements that achieve both parties' objectives. And then the parties can just sign up to those without too much pain and too much time. Because ultimately, if that process doesn't happen, it could really scupper the value of the IP. And that is no good for anybody.
Yeah. I'm optimistic in this case. There's things like the UCIT guides in the UK, there's the US BOLDS template in the US. So universities and lawyers and investors are making moves to standardize. It's just a very complicated process.
Yes, because there's so many stakeholders to achieve a common vision and common document that everyone's happy with. It's an incredibly challenging process. But at least ultimately, everyone's interests are aligned. We do want the company to succeed. The best case scenario is for the company to be very successful and everyone involved, all of those stakeholders, would get the benefit out of it. So as you say, the industry is moving towards absolutely the right direction. And I think it's just a fantastic trend to continue to see.
Yeah. And unfortunately, we are out of time. Winsome, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a huge pleasure to learn more about your work, and I look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity. It's really great to chat.
The Next Leap is hosted and produced by me, Thierry Heelis. Jenna Clark is the graphic designer, Alex White is the composer, and Roxy is the production supervisor and the best doggo in the world. If this is your first time listening, make sure to hit that follow or subscribe button, and if you enjoyed the show, please give us a rating and share it with your colleagues. It is the best way to help the podcast grow and to make sure I can get phenomenal guests like Winsome. If you have any feedback or are interested in being a guest on a future episode, email me at thierry@thenextleap.is, that's thierry@thenextleap.is, or message me on LinkedIn. And hey, did you know that The Next Leap isn't just a podcast, but I also help with media and data research. So if you'd like to work together or find out more about how I could help, shoot an email to that same address, thierry@thenextleap.is. Until next Tuesday, thank you for listening, or as we say back home in Luxembourg, merci, dass ihr geluisterd hebt.